The movie that terrified the world. I still remember the first time I watched The Exorcist. The lights were off, the room was quiet, and the only sound was the steady hum of my old TV. What began as curiosity turned into something far more chilling. The screen flickered, the music crept in, and suddenly, I wasn't just watching a movie. I was witnessing something that felt too real. When The Exorcist was released in 1973, it shocked the world. People fainted in theaters, some ran out screaming, and a few even claimed they felt possessed after watching it. The media called it the scariest film ever made. And they were right. But what most people didn't know, what I didn't know then, was that the story wasn't just a product of imagination. It was inspired by a real-life case, one so disturbing that it was buried for decades. I became obsessed with finding out more. Who was the real child behind The Exorcist? What really happened? I dove deep into old articles, interviews, and church records, and what I found made the movie look almost tame. It all began in 1949, more than 2 decades before the movie's release. The real story didn't take place in Georgetown or involve a little girl named Reagan. Instead, it centered around a 13-year-old boy known by the pseudonym Roland Doe. His real name was hidden by the church to protect his identity, but his case was very real. Roland lived in Cottage City, Maryland, a quiet suburb where nothing extraordinary ever happened. He was an only child, shy and close to his family, especially his Aunt Harriet. She was a spiritual woman who dabbled in the supernatural, often using a Ouija board to speak with the beyond. Roland was fascinated by it. He'd sit beside her, asking questions, watching the planchette glide across the board. But everything changed after Aunt Harriet passed away. That's when the strange things began. At first, it was small. The family heard scratching inside the walls as if rats had invaded the house, but pest control found nothing. Then they began hearing footsteps, faint whispers, and the sound of furniture moving on its own. One night, Roland's mattress started shaking violently while he was lying on it. I can't imagine the terror they must have felt. Imagine seeing your child's bed rattling uncontrollably, his eyes wide with fear and not knowing how to stop it. His parents did what anyone would do. They turned to science. Doctors examined him, psychiatrists interviewed him, but no one could find a logical explanation. That's when the family turned to the church. The first priest they contacted was Father Albert Hughes from St. James Catholic Church. Skeptical at first, he agreed to meet the boy, but what he witnessed during their sessions would haunt him forever. Roland reportedly spoke in guttural voices, cursed in Latin, and even reacted violently when holy objects were brought near him. It wasn't long before the church declared this a possible case of possession, something that hadn't been seen in America for decades. That was the moment when faith and fear collided. The priests would later document over 30 separate incidents. Levitating objects, scratches appearing on the boy's skin, and messages forming across his body that seemed to spell out words no one could explain. And as I read those records, one thought chilled me to the bone. This was real. This wasn't a Hollywood script. It happened to a real child, and it was witnessed by real people. When William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist, heard about Roland Doe's case while studying at Georgetown University, he knew it had to be told. But he also knew the world wasn't ready for the truth. So, he turned the boy into a girl, changed the names, and transformed one of the most terrifying true stories in history into a film that would haunt generations. But the real story, Roland's story, was only beginning. The boy, known as Roland Doe. As I dug deeper into the case, the name Roland Doe kept appearing like a whisper through history. Never the real name, just that alias. It was as if the church had locked his true identity away to protect him, or to protect the world from what he experienced. Roland was an ordinary 13-year-old boy living with his parents in a small 2-story house in Cottage City, Maryland. His father worked long hours, and his mother stayed home, tending to the house. He wasn't popular in school, quiet, polite, the kind of boy who preferred books and board games over playing outside. But what set him apart most was his deep attachment to his Aunt Harriet. She wasn't like the rest of the family. Harriet was fascinated by the spiritual world. She believed that life didn't end with death, that spirits lingered, waiting to be heard. She often used a Ouija board to communicate with friendly spirits, and young Roland was always by her side, eager to learn. When Aunt Harriet passed away suddenly in early 1949, Roland was heartbroken. For days, he refused to speak, clutching the Ouija board she had left behind as if it were his last connection to her. That's when the real nightmare began. It started small, faint scratching sounds behind the walls, like nails dragging through plaster. His parents assumed it was mice, but when the sound began moving from wall to wall, even up to the ceiling, fear started to set in. Then came the knocking. 3 loud, rhythmic thuds that echoed through the house at night. One evening, while Roland was sitting in his room, his mother heard him scream. When she rushed in, the chair he'd been sitting on was sliding across the floor by itself. The next night, his bed began to tremble. His parents tried to hold it down, but it was as if an invisible force was shaking it violently. I remember reading an old priest S note describing the scene. The boy, S bed, moved as though carried by unseen hands. Objects flew across the room. The boy seemed terrified, pleading for it to stop. The family tried to find rational explanations. They even moved to a relative's house in St. Louis, Missouri, hoping to leave whatever was haunting them behind. But the entity, whatever it was, followed. At school, teachers noticed Roland's behavior changing. He became irritable, distracted, and often complained of hearing voices. He told one classmate that he could feel something inside him, something angry. That's when his mother turned back to the church. The first priest, Father Albert Hughes, met Roland at their local parish. He saw deep scratches forming on the boy S' skin, words that seemed to appear on their own. One time, the word hell emerged across his chest in red marks. Father Hughes attempted a blessing, but as he prayed, Roland's demeanor changed. His voice deepened, his face twisted in rage, and he shouted obscenities that no child should even know. The priest reported that Roland broke free from his restraints, tearing open his mattress and hurling objects with impossible strength. The exorcism had to be stopped. After that, Father Hughes was hospitalized for injuries he received during the ritual, and the church decided the case needed to be handled elsewhere. The family, desperate and terrified, traveled once more to St. Louis, where relatives introduced them to a new priest, Father Raymond Bishop. This was where the most documented exorcism in American history would soon take place. Reading through the priest's diaries, I felt chills down my spine. Their accounts were eerily consistent. Strange markings, guttural voices, violent reactions to sacred objects. It wasn't just the boy's behavior that was unnatural. It was the environment itself. Lights flickered, furniture shook, and cold drafts swept through the room whenever prayers began. As I pieced together these reports, I couldn't help but wonder, was Roland truly possessed? Or was something else manipulating everyone around him? All I knew was that the line between faith and fear was about to be tested like never before. The real battle was about to begin. The first signs of possession. By the time Roland and his family reached St. Louis, fear had already consumed them. They believed they were running from something evil. But deep down, they knew whatever was haunting Roland wasn't something that could be escaped. It was inside him. I can only imagine what that must have felt like. To be a parent, watching your child's body move as if controlled by someone or something else. When I first read the detailed notes from Father Raymond Bishop, the priest assigned to investigate Roland's case, I remember feeling a deep chill. His diary didn't read like fiction. It read like a police report. Cold, precise, factual. That's what made it terrifying. According to Father Bishop, the strange phenomena began escalating quickly after Roland arrived in St. Louis. The family was staying at a relative's house, hoping that the change of place would calm the boy. But on the very first night, scratching sounds echoed through the walls again. Everyone heard them, not just Roland. Then came the bed, shaking. Every night around 8 p.m., the same pattern repeated. The boy would go to bed. The room would fall eerily silent, and then the mattress would begin to tremble violently. The family tried holding it down, praying, even sleeping in shifts to stay awake with him. Nothing worked. Soon after, things took a darker turn. One evening, Roland's mother noticed red scratches forming across his stomach. She described them as if something invisible were carving into his skin. Sometimes the marks would spell words: evil, hell, and once, the word Louis, appearing days before they decided to move to St. Louis. That was the moment I realized. The entity knew their plans before they did. And then came the voices. At first, Roland would mumble in his sleep, low, incoherent sounds that his family brushed off as nightmares. But soon, the words became clearer, deeper, and unlike his own voice. His mother swore she heard him speaking in Latin, a language the boy could not possibly know. When the priest sprinkled holy water in his room, Roland screamed, thrashing violently as if being burned. The temperature in the room would drop suddenly during these fits. Witnesses claimed they could see his eyes roll completely white and his body arch unnaturally off the bed. At this point, Father Bishop contacted his superior, Father William Bodern, a veteran Jesuit priest known for his strength of faith. When Bodern first met Roland, he described him as a quiet, frightened boy with a darkness behind his eyes. After witnessing one of Roland's violent episodes firsthand, where furniture moved, and the boy hurled insults in a deep, guttural voice, Bodern was convinced this wasn't a case for doctors anymore. It was time for the church to act. I can't imagine what went through those priests' minds that night. They were men of reason, of prayer. And yet here they were, standing before a child whose body seemed to be controlled by something ancient and malevolent. The first small exorcism was performed in the family's home. Candles flickered, prayers were whispered, and Roland's screams filled the air. As they recited the Roman ritual, his body contorted, his voice changing into something inhuman. At one point, he reportedly shouted, "You will lose," before the entire room went ice cold. Afterward, Father Bodern wrote in his notes, "The boy is possessed. The demon knows our names." That line stuck with me. It wasn't just an exorcism anymore, it was a war. From that night onward, the priests prepared for a full exorcism, one that would last not hours, but weeks. Roland's condition worsened, the entity growing stronger with every attempt to drive it out. The battle for his soul had begun, and it would push everyone, priest and family alike, to the edge of their faith and sanity. Desperate for answers. As I continued my research, I could feel the desperation in every line of the priest's journals. By this point, the family had exhausted every option. Doctors, psychologists, even family friends had all tried to help Roland. But whatever had taken hold of him defied logic, medicine, and prayer alike. I could almost picture it. A family sitting in the dim light of their living room, sleepless and terrified, as their only child screamed in voices not his own. Every night brought new horrors, objects flying, furniture overturning, and scratches appearing on the boy's body as though invisible claws were dragging across his skin. The priests knew they couldn't continue in the house. They needed a place where they could perform the ritual safely and privately. That's when they moved Roland to the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis. It was a quiet, isolated wing reserved for special cases. Few knew what was really happening inside those walls. Father William Bodern took charge of the exorcism, assisted by Father Walter Halloran, a young priest who would later become one of the few surviving witnesses. The two men prepared themselves spiritually, fasting, praying, and confessing before they began. What I read next in Halloran's notes still gives me chills. He described Roland sitting on the bed, eyes closed, breathing heavily. When the priests entered with holy water and the crucifix, the boy's demeanor changed instantly. His body stiffened, his head tilted backward, and his eyes rolled up until only the whites were visible. Then came a growl, low, deep, and filled with hatred. Father Bodern began reading from the rite of exorcism, commanding the spirit to reveal its name. The room grew cold. The lights flickered, and Roland began to laugh. A harsh, unnatural sound. "You think you can drive me out?" a voice hissed. "He is mine." At that moment, the boy's body lifted off the bed, hovering for several seconds before slamming back down with force that cracked the bed frame. Witnesses reported that furniture moved, holy water boiled on contact with his skin, and words continued to appear on his body. Messages like "no," "hate," and once the chilling phrase, "priests die." Every time the priests tried to stop, Roland would fall into a violent rage, cursing, spitting, and thrashing so violently that it took several men to restrain him. But the most terrifying part wasn't the physical violence. It was the voice. It spoke in multiple tones at once, sometimes as a man, sometimes as a woman, and once as a child crying for help. The priests wrote that it felt like there were many within him, fighting for control. After one session, Father Halloran noticed the boy's body marked again, but this time the word "exit" appeared across his chest. The priests believed this was a sign that the entity was weakening. But that hope vanished the next night when Roland's body convulsed violently, and he screamed, "He will never leave." At this point, exhaustion set in. Father Bodern was physically and spiritually drained. He confessed in his journal that doubt began to creep into his heart. Was this truly possession, or were they feeding something darker by believing in it? Still, they pressed on. For weeks, the ritual continued. Prayer, screaming, silence, then chaos again. The priests suffered injuries, scratches, bruises, and one broken nose when Roland struck Father Halloran across the face with superhuman strength. By now, everyone involved felt the same thing, that they were battling something far beyond human comprehension. And just when it seemed the demon would never let go, something extraordinary happened. During one of the final sessions, Roland suddenly screamed a name. "Michael!" The priests froze. When asked who Michael was, Roland cried out, "Michael, the Archangel! He fights for me!" Then, in one last, thunderous scream, he shouted, "Satan, leave this body now!" And suddenly, silence. The room was still. The boy lay unconscious. The air felt lighter, and the cold that had haunted the room for weeks finally lifted. But even as I read those words, I couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? Or had the evil simply gone quiet, waiting to return? The Exorcism Begins. When I reached the accounts of the full exorcism, it felt like stepping into a nightmare that no one could wake from. Everything that had happened before, the scratching, the voices, the shaking bed, was only the beginning. The real horror began when the priest decided to perform the official rite of exorcism in full. By then, Roland had been in St. Louis for weeks. His condition worsened each day. He'd wake up covered in scratches, his body contorting into impossible positions, and his voice, when it wasn't his own, was deep, mocking, and hateful. His eyes would roll white, and sometimes he'd speak in Latin, a language he had never learned. The priests gathered in the dim hospital room, the air heavy with incense and fear. Father Bodern, Father Halloran, and several assistants stood around Roland's bed, holding prayer books and crucifixes. A small candle flickered in the corner, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. As they began the prayers, Roland's body started to tremble violently. He let out a low growl that turned into a chilling, guttural laugh. Then, in a voice not his own, he said, "You will fail. He is mine." Those words sent chills down my spine. Even reading them decades later, I could almost hear that voice echoing through the dark room. Father Bodern pressed a crucifix to the boy's forehead and continued the prayers, reciting, I command thee, unclean spirit, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to depart from this servant of God." Roland screamed, his back arched, his body thrashing with unnatural strength. The straps holding him down tore loose. One of the priests was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible force. The room filled with the scent of sulfur and something burning. According to Father Halloran's diary, the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that their breath turned visible. The candlelight flickered violently, almost extinguished by a gust of cold wind that seemed to come from nowhere. And then the words began appearing again, carved into Roland's skin like invisible knives. Hell, devil, and once the word exit. Every time they appeared, Roland would scream as if being branded. The priests refused to stop. They continued night after night, each session lasting hours. During one of the exorcisms, Roland suddenly began speaking in perfect Latin, repeating the priest's prayers backward. His voice was mocking, filled with rage. When the crucifix was placed near him, he spat at it, laughing. Father Bodern later wrote that he felt a dark intelligence in the room, something ancient and calculating. This wasn't mindless chaos. It was deliberate, almost strategic. The entity knew when to attack, when to provoke, and when to disappear into silence, leaving only fear behind. At one point, Roland broke free from his restraints entirely and slashed one of the priests with a piece of broken spring from the bed. Blood splattered across the room, and yet, even then, the boy didn't seem aware of what he was doing. His voice, still not his own, mocked the priests. "You bleed, and still you think you can win." Despite the danger, they continued. They prayed louder, calling on the Archangel Michael, invoking the power of faith against whatever evil had claimed this boy. Finally, after hours of agony, Roland's body went still. His breathing slowed. The room fell into silence. The priests thought for a brief moment that it was over, but then, in the faint light of dawn, Roland opened his eyes, calm, quiet, and smiling. "He's gone," he whispered. "He said he would never come back." The priests looked at each other, unsure if they could believe it. Was it truly over? Or was this just another trick? For the first time in weeks, the boy slept peacefully. But Father Bodern wrote one final line that night in his journal, one that haunts me even now. "The devil is clever. Peace may only be his disguise." The battle between faith and evil. The priests thought the storm had passed, but they were wrong. What came next would test not only their faith but their sanity. After the exorcism at the hospital, Roland seemed calm for a few days. He ate, he slept, and for the first time in months, he smiled. His family began to believe the nightmare had finally ended. But darkness has a way of returning when you least expect it. Just 3 nights later, the scratching sounds came back. This time louder, angrier. The air in the room grew icy cold, and Roland woke up screaming, his body convulsing as if struck by lightning. His eyes rolled back, and a deep voice echoed through him. "I am not gone." When I read those words in the priest's notes, I remember shivering. It was as if the devil himself was mocking them, reminding everyone that evil doesn't surrender easily. Father Bodern and Father Halloran were called back immediately. The boy's bed shook violently as they entered, and a cross hanging on the wall snapped in half. The entity inside Roland was stronger now, more violent, more cunning. Every time the priests tried to pray, the voice inside the boy interrupted them, speaking in Latin, German, and even ancient Greek. The priests fasted and prayed for days, their bodies exhausted, their spirits drained. Bodern wrote that at times he felt physically sick while performing the ritual, as though the evil was feeding off his weakness. "I could feel it watching us," he wrote, "not just through the boy's eyes, but in the air, in the shadows. It wanted us to lose faith." The battle went far beyond holy water and prayers. This was psychological warfare. During one session, Roland suddenly went limp. then began to laugh. Not the voice of a child, but something far deeper, colder. The voice said, "He no longer believes." The priests froze. It was true. In that moment, doubt had crept into Bowden's mind. Was this truly possession, or had they been deceived by hysteria and fear? But before he could even process it, Roland's body lifted from the bed again, twisting in midair. The boy's mouth opened, and an inhuman scream filled the room. The lights burst, glass shattered. Everyone dropped to their knees, clutching their rosaries, praying louder than the storm that seemed to rage within those walls. I can't imagine the terror of that moment, hearing the clash of faith and something unholy, knowing that if you faltered for even a second, it might consume you. Then, in one of the most chilling moments recorded, Roland's body began to shake violently. The priests described it as if he were fighting something invisible inside him. His skin turned pale, his lips blue, and then he shouted in a voice that wasn't his own, "He will come." The priests demanded to know who. "Michael," the voice answered. For a moment, everything stopped. The air went still, the coldness lifted, and Roland's body relaxed. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, his own voice, he whispered, "Saint Michael, help me." According to witnesses, what happened next was beyond explanation. Roland's face twisted in pain, his back arched, and he cried out, "Satan, I command you to leave." A roar filled the room, loud, echoing like thunder. And then, silence. The boy collapsed. His breathing slowed. The priests held their crucifixes, afraid to move, waiting for another sign. But none came. The air warmed, and a deep peace settled over the room. Father Halloran later wrote, "At that moment, I felt light. The darkness lifted. It was as though 1,000 pounds had been lifted from our souls." The priests believed the Archangel Michael had come, that Roland had called upon him, and the battle was won. But as I closed the journal that night, I couldn't stop thinking, if angels and demons truly fought that night, what else walks unseen among us? The Final Confrontation. When I finally reached the final entries in the priests' journals, I could almost feel the exhaustion in their words. The battle had gone on for weeks. The nights were long, the prayers endless, and hope hung by a thread. Yet something told them the end was near. One final confrontation between light and darkness. Roland's body had grown weaker. He could barely eat or speak, and yet the entity within him was still powerful. Some nights the boy's voice would change suddenly, growling, mocking the priests, laughing in a tone that didn't belong to a human being. It wasn't constant anymore. It came in bursts like a dying fire that refused to go out. The priests decided to move him one last time, to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, into a small room at the end of a deserted hallway. There, surrounded by walls of prayer and faith, they would finish what they started. When Father Bowden entered that room on the final night, he carried with him a crucifix, a vial of holy water, and his faith, though it was hanging by a thread. He had aged visibly during the exorcism. His hands trembled as he began the prayers, his voice cracking. Father Halloran stood beside him, clutching his rosary so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Roland lay on the bed, his eyes closed. The room was unnaturally quiet. Then, slowly, his breathing changed. Deep, slow. And then that same low, guttural voice broke the silence. "He will never be free." The words echoed through the room, and the lights flickered. Bowden raised his crucifix. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to depart from this child." The boy's body jerked violently, his face twisting with pain. "You cannot drive me out," the voice snarled. "He belongs to me." The priests continued to pray louder. Roland began to thrash against the restraints, his hands clawing at the air. One of the nuns watching screamed as the bed lifted several inches off the ground, then crashed down with a thunderous bang. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped toward Father Bodern, his eyes glowing with fury. "I am many," the voice said, "and we will not go." At that moment, something strange happened. The air in the room seemed to vibrate, not with sound, but with presence. The priests later described it as a pressure, like being underwater. Bodern gripped the crucifix and shouted, "Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." Roland's body convulsed, arching so high it seemed impossible for a human spine to bend that way. Then, with all his remaining strength, the boy screamed. Not in fear, but in defiance. "Michael! Michael! Michael!" The priests joined him, repeating the name again and again until the room filled with the echo of it. Michael. The light bulb above them shattered. A blinding white light flashed through the room, followed by a deafening roar. Roland's body went rigid, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then, silence. Complete, absolute silence. The air softened, the temperature rose, the tension that had filled the room vanished. Roland's body went limp, his breathing returning to normal. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. No more rage, no more darkness. He looked at Father Bodern and whispered weakly, "He's gone." The priests watched for several minutes, unsure if they could believe it. But when Roland began to cry, genuine tears of relief, they knew it was over. The exorcism had ended. Father Bodern and Father Halloran collapsed to their knees in prayer, thanking God for victory. But both men would admit later that they never forgot the sound of that final scream, or the blinding light that filled the room. It was as if a war had been fought and won inside that small, silent room. And though Roland was free, the memory of what they had faced would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The truth revealed. What really happened? When I reached the final chapter of Roland Doe's story, I expected peace, a clean ending after all the horror. But what I found instead was something far more complicated. The exorcism had ended, yes, but the truth behind it still lived in the shadows, tangled between faith, fear, and disbelief. After the final ritual at the Alexian Brothers Hospital, Roland returned to his family. He had no memory of the events that had nearly destroyed him. His parents claimed he was calm, polite, gentle, the same quiet boy they'd known before the nightmare began. The priests who performed the exorcism never spoke publicly about it again. The church sealed the official records, labeling them confidential. But rumors spread. Journalists heard whispers about a possession in St. Louis. The story made its way to a young writer named William Peter Blatty, a student at Georgetown University. He was fascinated by the reports of a real exorcism performed on a boy in 1949, and he decided to turn that story into fiction. That's how The Exorcist was born. Blatty changed the details. The boy became a girl named Reagan. The setting moved from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., and the events were dramatized for horror. But at its heart, the movie carried the spirit of Roland Doe's ordeal, the battle between faith and evil, light and darkness, belief and doubt. Yet, even after decades, the question remains: was Roland Doe truly possessed? Or was something else happening? I've spent years reading through every available record, the priest's notes, witness statements, even interviews from those who knew Roland after the exorcism. And the answers are divided. Some say Roland suffered from mental illness, perhaps trauma after losing his beloved Aunt Harriet, or a rare form of dissociative disorder. The scratches and moving objects, skeptics argue, could have been caused by trickery, suggestion, or hysteria spreading among terrified witnesses. But then there are the priests, men of faith who had nothing to gain by lying. Their notes describe phenomena that no science can easily explain: words appearing on skin, levitation, and that chilling final moment when Roland cried out the name Michael, followed by a blinding flash of light. Father Halloran, one of the last surviving witnesses, was asked decades later if he believed Roland was possessed. He paused for a long time before saying, "I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't human." That line stayed with me, because maybe that's what makes this story so powerful. Not the horror itself, but the mystery that still lingers behind it. The Exorcist terrified millions because, deep down, it forced us to confront something we all wonder about but never want to face. Is evil real? I learned that the Alexian Brothers Hospital wing where the exorcism took place was later demolished in the 1970s. Workers who helped tear it down reported strange noises, voices, footsteps, unexplained chills. Some refused to go near the old room. The records stored there vanished, said to have been destroyed by the church for the safety of others. As for Roland, he grew up, changed his name, and lived a quiet, private life. He never spoke publicly about what happened. Neighbors described him as kind, polite, and deeply religious. He avoided any discussion about the Exorcist, though he was said to flinch when people mentioned it. I don't blame him. After reading everything, I realized The Exorcist wasn't just a horror movie. It was a glimpse into a real struggle between belief and the unknown. Maybe Roland's story was about faith under fire, or maybe it was proof that some things still lie beyond human understanding. When I finished my research that night, I turned off the light and sat in silence. The world outside was calm, but in my mind, that hospital room still existed. A place where a boy fought the darkness and somehow survived. And as I stared into the dark, I found myself whispering the same words that ended the priest's journals. May the Lord protect us from the things we cannot see.